Syria and Iraq as an example today. So I would like to start with a case study, a timeline of the Paris attacks. Does anyone remember the Paris attacks? Raise your hand. All right, those who don't remember it, it happened in 2015, around November 12 exact. There was a video released with the title, "Soon, very soon, the blood will spill like an ocean." It was created in Russian, and it was posted all over the web and widely watched. It was graphic. It had threats for attacks by ISIS. I'm not going to show the video. It's quite graphic. The next day, November 13, at 9:20 p.m., there's a hostage situation and attacks in Paris that most of you are familiar with. There's at around midnight, 12:20 a.m., the French police stormed the areas where there were hostages, and there was a conflict between the hostage takers and the police, and the final toll was 89 people killed. So this is right after, just 24 hours after the video was released, so try to remember that. At 1:20 a.m., just an hour after the storming of the concert hall, tweets start appearing, pro-ISIS tweets start appearing, with hashtags that were prepared in advance, it seems, images. Specifically, I'd like you to look at the image below with the French flag and the footprint on it. Hashtags in Arabic and sometimes in English, Paris burning or Paris. And of course, eventually this started to trend. This is one of the signatures of ISIS attacks. Whenever some attack happens, a lot of tweets, a lot of social media content comes out in support of these attacks, even before ISIS officially declares that this is their responsibility. They usually use a three-tiered strategy. The three-tiered strategy basically is the main core leadership of ISIS tweets a message out, and then each one of them retweets their messages, and then the second level, I would call them the lieutenants, maybe 30 to 50 ISIS commanders start retweeting each of these messages and retweeting themselves, and then the broad supporters across the globe of ISIS start doing the same, which create what we call a Twitter storm and brings the messages up. It starts trending, and then the mass media, the traditional media, also jump in and start giving it even more exposure. Eventually, ISIS figured that instead of doing this manual process of having people tweet and retweet and waiting for messages to come out, they created an app, and a lot of people downloaded it without even knowing. At one point, it was not this FIFA, the one before that. They downloaded the app. It takes over your phone contacts and starts retweeting the messages when they send them out. So going back to the timeline, on November 14 at 12:55, ISIS claims responsibility. So even before they claimed responsibility, a lot of tweets and messages on social media were coming out. And then they sent out the official press release of that responsibility. And of course, supporters around the world start retweeting it and sending it out. So you would think a press release like that or a message like that will be immediately subdued and cut off, but they also have a very sophisticated way of doing it, and I'm going to show you an example of that press release. So if you think of any kind of organization, any kind of website, any kind of social media trying to remove this, they have a solution for it. They post multiple links on multiple platforms. By the time anyone could remove anything, the message has already been spread around the world and respread and respread. And we can keep on going. The more important part was what happened just 2 hours after that press release. At 3 p.m., a repurposed, recreated ISIS video that calls for recruitment was released, and I'm going to show you parts of that video. The core message here is for Muslims, especially in France, to to join the fight in Syria and Iraq, or to fight inside of Europe. As you see the video, notice the sophistication in the production and the quality.
Celui qui mécroit au Tarout et qui croit en Allah a certes ses lances la plus solide qui ne peut se briser, et Allah est celui qui entend et celui qui sait. Comme vous avez mécrit au Tarout, comme vous avez mécrit à la démocratie et à la loi humaine, en faisant le hijra, aujourd'hui vous mécroyez à ces tawarites et à toute cette loi.
So the video obviously is in French with Arabic and English translation, and at some point you see the ISIS fighters burning their passports, and the message starts.
As-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Ceci est un message pour tous les musulmans qui vivent encore en terre de mécréance. De la part de vos frères qui ont immigré, vos frères français. Qu'attendez-vous?
And throughout the video, there's shaming of Muslims in France. What are you waiting for? Your brothers and sisters are fighting, they are winning, they are expanding. The Islamic State is growing, the Khilafah is becoming stronger. What are you waiting? And if you cannot come for any reason, why don't you fight inside France or inside Europe? And they, I think, strategically pick speakers who are maybe somewhat attractive. I'm not an expert on that in that area. But you can see they're at least charismatic.
Dans la terre du Khilafah, cette Khilafah qu'on a tant rêvé. Et je dis à mes frères et mes sœurs, bifadlillah, on a fait le bay'a.
So right after that video, about a day later, there's multiple images and videos celebrating the Ghazwat Paris, or the attack on Paris, or the invasion of Paris. The celebration of Muslims, you can see the Eiffel Tower burning with the French flag being toppled, people giving out candy, etc., etc. And then on the 17th, ISIS, one of their main media outlets, Al-Batar Media, releases another video warning, this time with the title, Message to the Nation of the Cross. And this one is specifically bloody. I'm going to show you a small part of it at the beginning, but not all of it. Notice the rhetoric here, notice the message, what kind of conflict in the world, what kind of worldview they're trying to advance.
A Russian passenger plane flying from Egypt's Sharm el-Sheikh to St. Petersburg has disappeared from the radar.
If it was something that was strong enough to bring the aircraft down, it's going to do a lot of wreckage to the frame, to the airframe.
A Paris evening erupts in violence. Dozens have been killed in shootings and explosions, the deadliest attacks in France in decades.
This is an attack not just on Paris, it's an attack not just on the people of France, but this is an attack on all of humanity and the universal values that we share.
Shot at us for like 10 to 15 minutes. It was a bloodbath.
The video becomes pretty graphic from here on. I'm not going to show you these parts. But it's quite interesting and curious why they would put a soundbite of the US president saying this is an attack on humanity. It's something that they're also proud of. And this is something that we are doing. It is huge, it is great. But the more important part is that it is rooted in a rhetoric of a clash of civilizations, a clash of religions, Muslims versus Christians or Muslims versus anything else. Then, a day later, their magazine comes out with the 3 attacks that happened around almost the same time. An attack in Beirut, actually, that wasn't really covered by international media that much, although it had the highest toll in terms of killed and wounded. The downing of the Russian plane above Sinai, and the attack on Paris. And for anyone who has worked on a magazine before, knows how long it takes to produce a professional quality, high-level magazine, sometimes weeks, sometimes even months. I'm going to show you a small section of this, and you can notice here the word just terror, which also maybe plays on word. It's either only terror or justified terror. I think it's they meant more justified terror, and you will see this in their messages throughout their videos, justifying why what they're doing is right, is a response to something, is something that is good and not evil, actually. But more importantly, notice, let me try to bring this down a little bit. Notice the quality of production. This might as well be Newsweek or Time magazine. If you read through the text, you'll find there's barely any typo, any grammatical error, just a professionally produced magazine in record time. I'm going to read to you small parts of it here. This article was first published in the Sawt al-Jihad, so they even make sure not to violate copyright. The author of this piece, etc., etc. I am pleased to present my advice to the Mujahideen in particular and the Muslims in general throughout Sawt al-Jihad magazine. And then he gives them a lot of advice. I'll just run through the different pages. In some places they're attacking the West, in other places they're attacking Arab regimes. They're also attacking different rival extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda, and justifying their own ideology and approach. I will say in a moment. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? شو رأيك؟
بسأل يعني على ماذا تدل هذه الاحترافية والجودة في استخداماتهم
رح جاوبك، بس شو رأيك؟ بيهمني رأيك كمان.
بس أنا مجرد سؤال فقط يعني.
ممكن في شخص ورا كان حابب يجاوب.
صباح الخير دكتور. باعتقادي انه تنظيم داعش رغم بشاعته لكن كان ذكي جدا في مواجهة الخطاب الرسمي بالنسبة للدول بآلة إعلامية متطورة جدا. رغم وحشيته كان يخاطب يعني الجانب اللي يفتقر له الشباب العربي تحديدا المسلم، وانه يحقق نوع من الانتصارات وهو ما يبحث عنه الشباب البائس واللي ملحق بالكثير من الهزائم. لذلك كان داعش ذكي جدا في هذا الخطاب رغم هذه الوحشية، وبطريقة حديثة جدا وطريقة تكنولوجية متطورة جدا، وكان يستخدم كل التقنيات. لذلك كانت الدول عاجزة أمام هذه الآلة الإعلامية بالنسبة لتنظيم داعش، وما كان يخفي هذه الوحشية.
ثانكس. حدا ثاني ممكن ياخذ رأيين بعد، بس بسرعة إذا ممكن، مش بناخذ وقت كثير. شو السبب؟
الآن ليس فقط بخصوص المواد الإعلامية، داعش يمتلك وسائل تكنولوجية متطورة.
لا بس خلينا نجاوب على سؤال الزميل بس.
الآن ممكن أنا أسأل سؤال ثاني، كيف؟
لا بس بدنا نجاوب على سؤال.
هو إضافة، كيف استطاع داعش تجنيد؟
بدنا نجاوب على سؤال الزميل، إذا بدك تسأل سؤال ثاني بدنا نحكي بعدين.
بس نقطة إذا ممكن تذكرها في محاضرتك، إنه كيف استطاع تجنيد العديد من الشباب العربي المثقف والذي يمتلك أعلى الشهادات عن طريق الإعلام. شكرا يا دكتور.
خلينا ناخذ بعد بس.
I think part of it is to build a brand because for any company, let's just say it's a business, for any company, if they're making a lot of profit, if they're making a great impact on, and that's a positive impact, let's say, if they don't communicate what they do in a very solid way, and for us, for their target audience, as my classmate or my colleague mentioned, it's a well-educated audience. So when they see this well-established brand with all this level of professionalism, regardless of the content, of course, in terms of how they communicate their message and how well the messages is targeting even the segments within the audience that they're, let's say, a graphic designer or like someone who's interested in the content, and I'm talking, of course, from the communication perspective.
Right, but I want you to be very brief. So there's a lot of people who want to speak. And
so I think it's partially to build this brand of Daesh.
All right, thank you. بسرعة، أوكي.
بما إنه حضرتك عم تقول إنه شو بيعني، فمن هذا بيطرح تساؤلات إنه في جهات معينة عم تدعم هذا الموضوع. في مرة بلقاء جامعي، عفوا عن برامج من برامج الفوتوشوب، يقال إنه فيديو مسرب لعملية عم بيكون فيها، عم يحكوا فيها واحد بدهم يذبحوه، بس هو فعليا كان قاعد باستوديو، حتى عم يعمل مقارنة بين الاستوديو اللي عم يحكوا فيه وبين إحدى استوديوهات هوليوود. فهون هذا بيطرح تساؤلات انه مين بالضبط الجهات اللي عم تدعم هيدا الاطراف.
شكرا لك. طبعا هذا دائما وقت بعطي هالمحاضره sorry I need to go switch to English. هلا we will have more time to talk. Often when this question is asked, and you asked it right before I did, the default answer is always a conspiracy, right? There's somebody doing all these and creating all these for them. Frankly, our study and our research has shown that there is no big conspiracy where the West is producing videos and producing media. But I'll go into a lot of details throughout the lecture to show you how this group has been able to create capacity for building and producing these media, and not only doing that, also innovating through the use of terrorism synchronized with media. Terrorism synchronized with media, and I will explain what that is in a moment. What you were saying was right. One of the things that they are doing, building a brand, building a professional image, and what does that give? That gives credibility, right? This is not just another small extremist group. This is a professional group trying to build a state, and this is one of the points that I'd like to go into. More importantly, what I just presented to you as a case actually occurred quite often. Sometimes not 100%, especially towards the last couple of years when ISIS was pretty much hammered and kicked out of the cities they occupied and out of the lands they controlled, but especially at the beginning, at the peak of their power. Message that threatens, terror attack, a lot of media coverage, both through social media and through mass media, and then a message of recruitment. Almost always this is a cycle that they do, and then followed by another threatening message that follows the same trend. So what happened after the Paris attack? In general, two things. Striking fear among many Europeans, especially in France, but there was also followed by an attack in Brussels after that and several attacks in Europe. A rising sentiment of anti-Muslims and anti-immigrants in general, especially in Europe, and you would think maybe this is a bad side effect to this. But as we read through what ISIS is actually doing, intentionally actually pushing people to the brink towards falling into their lap. So the more Europeans who become anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, marginalized Muslims and immigrants in Europe, the more they are actually pushing these groups into the laps of ISIS. Like one of our colleagues in the back said, these groups suffer from a gap, whether it's ideological or cultural gap or being marginalized in society, and when there's a group that tries to address their grievances, then they're more likely to fall into their message, to fall into their recruitment. And the third thing is more media exposure, more brand recognition out there, which equals to more credibility, to more power as a visual element, and to more recruitment in the long term. We were in Salzburg a couple years ago, and there was a so-called terrorist attack that happened. Some guy ran into a train station and hacked people with an axe. 2 days later, everybody was anxious, and our students were going around Europe. We had 25 students from Lebanon and the Arab world, and there was this story that suddenly came out. A group of Muslims were just praying, and next to them a group of Europeans in Germany, a group of Germans were actually putting candles and commemorating those who died in a terrorist attack. And what they couldn't understand what was happening. The German group thought that the Muslims were actually criticizing them or making chants against them, and then there was a lot of tension. So this is again an example of what happens among these communities when such attacks happen. So what were the long-term consequences of ISIS? And I know, you know that ISIS is almost as an entity, as a political entity, almost wiped out, at least in this part of the world. They're trying to grow their power in North Africa and Southeast and South Asia. So what they did is they recreated a model of media synchronized with terrorism that their predecessors, whether it's Al-Qaeda or others, have done. They enhanced their exposure. They put out a narrative, their own narrative and story, their own view of the world, which somewhat synchronizes, unfortunately, today with many politicians around the world. A clash of civilizations, a clash between Muslims and others. And they were able to enhance their recruitment, and they offered a stronger model for future groups. And this is one of the reasons why I still keep giving this lecture, although ISIS is pretty much wiped out. ISIS was a splinter group from Al-Qaeda. They used the knowledge that Al-Qaeda achieved and the experience that Al-Qaeda achieved and went a step forward. And my fear is that the next group will build on this experience, on this knowledge, and even take it further. So at the peak of ISIS, and I'm going to show you a map here. Those of you from Iraq and Syria, I know this strikes home, and this is a very familiar problem. This was around 2016 in December. This is how big they were able to grow. Small part of Lebanon, a big chunk of Syria, almost encroaching on the capital and major cities. A big part of Iraq, also almost encroaching on taking major cities in Iraq. At one point, at the peak, the land ISIS controlled was as big as the United Kingdom, and they controlled over 10 million people. Of course, today, I think I can show you. What are we, August 9? Let's see August 8. They have been reduced to these parts. You can go to liveuamap.com. And it also has, this is an amazing new media tool where you can follow conflicts around the world. It has a map for Syria, it has a map for Iraq. This shows you the progress of the conflict in Syria. The orange part is controlled by the Assad government. This is controlled by the Kurdish powers. This is still controlled by anti-Assad government. And there are different groups here. You have Americans and Turks in this group, in this area, and in this area. And little pockets of ISIS too. You can check this every day. You can go back in time. You can create different models of it. Go ahead. Somebody has a question?
مرحبا. أنا بالبداية كان موضوع رسالة الماجستير أنه أحلل مضمون مجلة دابق. فبالفعل سويت دراسة استطلاعية على عينة من منشوراتهم. فوجدت أنهم مستخدمين الأساليب الدعائية الأكاديمية اللي إحنا ندرسها بشكل احترافي. ووظفوا أغلب الأساليب يعني بنوها على نصوص دينيه محرفه او غير دقيقه او اقتطعوا مثل ما تسوي وسائل الاعلام الحديثه، يعني انه حدث تتناول من عنده في جانب معين، تناولوا جانب معين من النصوص الدينيه ووظفوه. هذا من باب اخر انه
لحظه بس بدك عندك سؤال ولا
لا عفوا هو
إيه؟
اضافه
طيب.
اذا امكن يعني
خلينا نضيفهم للاخر، اذا عندك سؤال اسالني اياه هلا، بس خلي الاضافات للاخر، رح يكون معنا ربع ساعه.
ما عندي شيء، خلصت استاذ.
طيب اوكي ثانك يو.
اي نعم، لحظه تسمح لي يعني
اذا بدك تضيف خليها للاخر، اذا بدك تسال اسال.
ثانك يو
اوكي ثانك يو. طيب سؤال؟ اوكي تفضل.
مرحبا دكتور، بس كنت عم بسأل على الخريطة اللي قبل شوي ورجيتنا عليها، يا ترى مين بيحط هاي الداتا؟ يعني مين بيقرر انه هاي المنطقة عن جد تحت سلطة مين؟
في منظمة بتتابع، وفي الجوريثم بيسحب الأخبار من عدة مؤسسات، وبحسب هيدي الأخبار بيغطوا على الخريطة المناطق مين بيتحكم فيها. There's a lot of information online that you can look at. Okay. And just go to About Us, and they have a lot of details about what they do, how they do it, what are their news sources, and quite often they triangulate news sources just to be accurate. Okay. So the big question about ISIS is how were they able to recruit so many people? How were they able to recruit? That was your question. How were they able to recruit people who are educated, people who are living in comfortable lives in the West, people who may not even be Muslims, who converted to Islam to join them, people from all walks of life, if we may exaggerate a bit there. And this is actually what all of us have been studying, and this whole lecture tries to answer that question. What I'd like to start with before answering why were they able to do that is to try to reframe ISIS. We try to sometimes jump into conspiracy theories or jump into simplistic analysis of ISIS being this evil group, irrational groups who just bent on killing people, or some conspiracy theories that there's, I don't know, the West is controlling this group and they have experts on the ground and the others are just being put on camera and there's no actual agency for the members of ISIS. What I'd like to argue today in this lecture is to think beyond the stereotype of what a terrorist group is, okay? These evil, irrational people. To think of them actually as rational groups, having intentional goals, very calculating. To think of them as a virtual state, because this was actually their claim, to build a state, to build a khilafah, right? And they call themselves an Islamic state. And to use methods that many states around the world, modern methods, such as public diplomacy. The US uses that, Europe uses that. I'll go more into details on this. And to capitalize and build on the populist rhetoric that has spread around the world in the last few years, along with a vacuum in ideology that exists right now, and a political vacuum and a military vacuum that exists right now in many parts of the Arab world. So trying to understand the terrorism-media relationship is also important today. A lot of you are journalists or aspiring journalists. Being able to cover terrorism in a way that does not feed into the support and the goals of groups like ISIS is very important to us, and understanding the dual message of terrorism. Terrorism is a military tactic that has multiple dimensions, and being able to have a sophisticated understanding of it and its relationship to media is very important, especially for journalists, but specifically also for citizens whom we're trying to make more media literate. So I use the word virtual state. If we think of ISIS as a virtual state or an aspiring state that uses terrorism as opposed to a group of crazy terrorists. And this is an idea that didn't come from me. I read this in Foreign Affairs. It was an article that tried to differentiate between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And this is the main differing point between these two groups. Al-Qaeda thought we're not ready yet to build a state, while ISIS said, no, this is the time when we need to do it. Al-Qaeda wanted to fight the enemy that is further away, the West, while ISIS wanted to fight inside the lands that it claimed it to be its own. So one of the big questions that we often shy away from, and especially Western journalists and politicians, in order to delegitimize certain groups, we don't ask the question of why do groups use terrorism. Many groups around the world, legitimate and illegitimate, have used terrorism. Many governments around the world have used terrorism. It is a military tactic with specific purposes, to demoralize a government, an opposing government, by demoralizing the people and striking a lot of fear into these people in order for these people to put pressure on their government. But many groups try to use terrorism also, especially today in this media climate that we have, in order to gain recognition, gain credibility, and gain exposure for their causes and for their grievances. So going back to this thing we called a virtual state. If you keep thinking of ISIS, specifically in the past 2-3 years, as a small group of bandits, of irrational bandits, this will not help us to be able to deal with the next ISIS that's coming up. Think of a virtual state, and Philip Sieb here talks about a virtual state in 3 categories. Either a recognized virtual states like diaspora groups, Iraqis living in America, Pakistanis living in Canada, etc. These governments, the Iraqi governments, the Pakistani government, may target these groups in order to bring them back home or have them send investment and send money back home. Another example of a virtual state is a de facto nation, like Palestine. It's not recognized fully today by the United Nations, etc., but there is a recognition that this is a country, this is a state, this is a group, this is a nation. Same thing with Kurdistan. A non-state actor today also could be considered a virtual state, any NGO, but also ISIS or any group that has aspirations to recruit people from outside its border. So why is it important to think of this concept, the theoretical concept of a virtual state? Once we start thinking of ISIS as a virtual state or a state, we can start seeing how they actually act as a state. Especially when they occupy certain areas and immediately start erecting the economic power of it in order to gain money. They start putting rules, they start installing officials, police, and controlling the order there. But at the same time, they use certain methods that the state used to attract people from outside their borders. Here's an example, here's the definition of what Sieb says public diplomacy is. Public diplomacy is one of the important methods today used around the world by various governments. It's an element of diplomacy that involves government reaching out to foreign public rather than to another government. So think of Lebanon trying to communicate with Lebanese in the US, for example, in America. Instead of going through the government to communicate with them, the Lebanese government would use certain communication campaigns to target the Lebanese immediately. Maybe for tourism season, to attract them to come back to their country. Maybe for elections, to attract them to come back and vote. Many governments around the world, again, use public diplomacy. This is a classic example of public diplomacy. Any kind of international sports event. Russia today is on the offensive when it comes to improving its image around the world, whether it's through the Sochi or the Russia 2018 FIFA game. Are you familiar with these logos? Ironically, this is the second most seen logo there. But the US actually is one of the governments that is the government that I would say invented this type of communication method, and it has become very powerful in using it. I'm going to show you a video created by the USAID is the entity of the US government that gives out money throughout the world, sometimes for scholarships and sometimes for other things. And as you can see from their definition, promoting US foreign policy and economic growth by assisting those in need. So all of you getting scholarships from USAID, I'm joking. Here's a video produced by the State Department.
Every day, millions of people worldwide use online social networks to share photographs, make connections, and cement friendships. but a growing number are also pioneering a much more innovative use, transforming the internet into a powerful tool for change. These individuals, harnessing the ability to instantly communicate with millions of others, are using social networking sites to launch grassroots movements, to organize rallies, protests, and smart mobs, to resist oppression, circumvent censorship, and denounce violence. In short, they are converting online activism into concrete, real-world results. New media company Howcast joined forces with the U.S. State Department, Google, Facebook, YouTube, MTV, and other sponsors to host the first ever Alliance of Youth Movement Summit. The conference brought together delegates representing 17 pioneering youth movements from around the world.
Part of what we want to do here is bring groups together, share common practices, and try to inspire other groups to harness the same technologies in order to push for positive political and social change.
We have a Facebook cause with over 500,000 friends, a MySpace page with 250,000 friends, and an email list which numbers in the hundreds of thousands.
I think we promote democracy basically by being what we are, by making the world more open, by making people more connected, by giving them a forum to be able to be heard. The nature of being connected is diametrically opposed to isolation and extremism.
France also is actually pretty good at using public diplomacy, especially in Lebanon and in North Africa, where there's a huge Francophone community. But I'll move on from that back into the media. Why do we care about public diplomacy? And here's a quick definition from Entman when they studies mediated public diplomacy, which is more short-term than long-term. Mediated public diplomacy is targeted short-term aims that utilize media technologies to increase support of a country's specific foreign policies among audiences beyond that country's border. So try to think about that and think of ISIS and what they were trying to do. I don't know if this applies. Targeted short-term aims of ISIS. 1, exposure. Think about what Russia is doing today, for example, through FIFA and other events. Credibility, which is something that somebody who is unknown doesn't have, right? You try to remember who are the many groups in Syria and Iraq that were fighting in the past 10 years. ISIS is just one of hundreds of other groups. Many of them small groups, just a dozen or a few hundred people. However, ISIS was able to emerge as a very credible, strong threat. And the most important part is recruitment. So this is what I would claim is ISIS's public diplomacy aims or targets through the use of terrorism and media. If you think of how the French government, the French politicians came to Lebanon to target certain voters, those of you who are voting in Lebanon in the past elections, you can try to copy that method and see how ISIS is doing roughly the same thing but through recruitment. Targeting voters outside their border, targeting Muslims in Europe, targeting non-Muslims who actually might be interested in coming just for the thrill of the fight, in a climate of populism. So the word populism here, and I define it in a specific way in a moment, and the climate that has existed in Europe and the US, these ultra-right and right-wing groups that have been using demagoguery, using certain divisions in society, racism, different rhetorics in order to attract votes, in order to win power. This is what one of your colleagues said. There's a group of Arabs, there's a group of Muslims who feel disenfranchised, right? Who feel left out. And this group called ISIS is trying to use certain rhetoric to fill in this gap in order to attract them. What is populism? And I like to use the word demagoguery more accurately. غوغائية in Arabic. So demagoguery is defined as the following: gaining power, gaining popularity by exploiting people's fears, prejudices, grievances, divisions, beliefs, identities, and aspirations, and presenting oneself as a solution, an alternative, a protection to the corrupt elite or status quo or to the existing threat. This is to a large extent what a lot of European alt-right politicians did. This is to a large extent what the current US president did. I'm not going to try to throw jokes there, although everybody does. And this is exactly what politicians in Lebanon, what politicians in the Arab world try to do. They use a threat, an existing grievance. They use existing ideas, whether it's sectarianism in Lebanon and Iraq and in Syria, in order to galvanize, in order to activate certain sentiments, certain beliefs, and lead people whether to vote or to fight for or against a certain cause. But more importantly, as media people, as journalists, as media literacy educators, we want to understand the relationship between these matters, between populism, demagoguery, and the media. And one of the most important or most interesting matters, which Mazzolini writes about, you guys should try to look up his book on this matter. He has a whole book on populism and media. He says, all neo-populist movements rely heavily on complicity with the mass media, and all are led by politicians who are shrewd and capable newsmakers themselves. In many ways, there is no populism without the media, right? If you have a certain belief in society, racism, sectarianism, sexism that you want to exploit, if there's no mass media coverage for it that reaches a large number of people, you will not succeed in that. So the media have to somewhat be complicit in spreading your message. And we today are in a beautiful climate in terms of the media for populism. The mass media, the traditional media, the establishment media are losing money. They need to attract a lot of audiences. They're desperate for attracting a lot of audiences in order to keep their revenues up. So they will take anything and everything that will attract these media. Sensationalism, scandals, celebrity information, and of course, attacks by politicians on others that will attract a lot of audiences. The climate that we live in today, the media climate we live in today, is very weakened against populist rhetorics. Here are also from Mazzolini the elements that weaken media in the face of populism. Market logic and dwindling profits, which I just talked about. Blurred lines between politics and entertainment. Oh, I think what Anna spoke about yesterday in terms of infotainment. Fake news, post-fact society, what Paul spoke about in terms of lack of trust in media today, and lost credibility, whether it's Western media or local media, right? We, in the US, the attacks on the media claim that, oh, all of these media are liberal media, so you can actually galvanize a lot of conservative groups against the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all of these matters. In our part of the world, we consider the Western media to be anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, right? And you can find many, many examples. This is an example that I use in my classes quite often. US to issue terror warnings to Americans in Europe. But this was not the first image that was posted. This was the first image that was posted, right? And this is a respected media outlet, The Guardian, and a news article that was fed by the Associated Press. And these are examples that you can see throughout. That would also lower the credibility of the media in general. So what is the populist rhetoric of ISIS? We said they have this rational, intentional goals and thinking, and I'm going to show you examples of that in a moment. So the first thing that feeds into their populism, into their demagoguery, the corrupt status quo, right? And you will see that in almost every video, every message they put out. The status quo of Muslims today. Palestine is occupied. The Muslim world is divided. Weak economy, unemployment, puppet regimes. And they keep on insisting on these puppet regime highlighting. And I'll show you videos about the Jordanian pilot that was captured and burnt alive, and how a big chunk of the video is attacking and highlighting the relationship between the King of Jordan and the West. The alternative, we are the solution, right? After a century of secular regimes in the Arab world turning into dictatorships and not serving their own people and enriching themselves and then being toppled, there's lost credibility in all secular ideology, unfortunately, today in the Arab world. So there's a vacuum in ideology. There's a vacuum in the thoughts and aspirations of people. So here ISIS comes and presents an alternative. We are the solution. And then the third element is polarization, which I hinted to a little bit earlier, or what I call eliminating the gray. In many cases, ISIS tries to push societies to the brink, to polarize different groups in societies, like the example that I gave in Europe, by attacking French in Paris, creating anti-sentiment, anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment, pushing these minorities in France and throughout the world into being more marginalized, more disenfranchised, and bringing them closer and closer to themselves. So all of these ideas are not interpretations, are not analysis. These are ideas that explicitly written in text that ISIS actually follows. They are explicitly written in a book called Managing Savagery. And this book, oops, this is the video, hold on. This text was actually written before ISIS even existed and was used by Al-Qaeda. It was written by Abu Bakr Naji. And in many texts, it's online, by the way, and if you cannot find it online, I'll be glad to share it with you. It has specific goals, and here I have some translations for it. What we mean by polarization, so that's not a word that I'm using, that's a word they use. What we mean by polarization here is pushing nations towards a battle wherein polarization takes place among all the people, where one side joins the righteous and another side joins the evil. And a third neutral side waits for the battle's outcome before joining the victorious, and we must attract this third group. This is the eliminating of the gray. There's only black and white in the ISIS ideology. We're either with us or against us. Oops, did George Bush also say that? Right? This is how you can create a world that is polarized, with us or against us. You either step with us or you're gonna be fighting us. Pushing nations into battle requires more military operations that force people to enter battle, whether they want it or not. So societies turn into two viciously battling sides. In the early phase, when opposition media are strong, we must send messages before military operations. Again, what we found through the trends of what they do is something explicitly written in text that they follow. We send messages before military operations are conducted in order to justify them. Then opposition media will eventually fail to control and distort its coverage. This is a very important point that I'd like to emphasize in a moment. As the frequency and the magnitude of the operations increase, in the final phase, we must propagate how safe, just, and organized the areas we control are, and that's when people will flock into our areas and join us. So again, this is direct translation from Management of Savagery. I'm not going to read it in Arabic in favor of time, but I do have a short video that explains it. The music on its own is pretty terrifying, isn't it? But I mean, some of you can argue, is like, but hold on, how are they going to really weaken the media and get their messages through? That just doesn't make any sense. There's a lot of blood, there's a lot of explosion, but that's specifically it. This is exactly what I mean by synchronizing terror and the media message. If we go back to that magazine that we spoke about earlier, we go back to these tweets that we spoke about earlier, there's something interesting about them. They just seem to be well prepared and prepared in advance. So I claim here, using this evidence, that what is happening with ISIS, what they innovated is they have brought the military and the media people to the same table when it comes to planning. So you can imagine a group of military leaders planning to plot a terrorist attack in a certain area, but the media personnel are also there. And they're working together in sync in order to maximize the message. And this is what brings me to this media-terrorism relationship. I'll define it very quickly based on Wilkinson's research. Terrorism is a premeditated act or threat designed to create a climate of fear directed at a wider target than the immediate victims. Directed at a wider target than the immediate victims. Inherently involves random or symbolic targets, especially civilians, used primarily to influence governments, communities, or specific social goals. So again, this sentence that is highlighted, directed at a wider target than the immediate victims. What does that mean? I just want two people to quickly tell me, what does that mean? Go ahead.
Well, it means that it needs to be mediated to have its meant effect. So the media is, of course, the only tool to do so.
Exactly, exactly. This is if there's one element I'd like you to take from this, is the relationship between media and terrorism. The importance of media to terrorism. Media comprise terrorism's oxygen. There is no terrorism without a media. If you think of that philosophical question we used to take when we started college, if a tree falls in the middle of the desert and nobody heard about it or reports it, did it actually happen? It's the same thing with terrorism. If a terrorist attack takes place and nobody reports it, nobody propagates it, nobody sends it out, is it actually a terrorist attack? If you think of, la samah Allah, somebody comes into this room and conducts a terrorist attack, what this means that we are not the target. We are not the target of this attack. The broader world is the target. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, whatever citizens we have in this part of the world. Because the media is going to cover that and is going to spread the fear that is generated by this terrorist attack. So here comes an element that I also would like you to really think carefully about when it comes to terrorism. You would say, well, why would a group brand itself in such an evil way of killing, cutting people's head, blowing people up, and burning people alive? Well, this is precisely the dual message of terrorism. One, spreading fear, striking fear into the hearts of its enemies. Those of you who remember when ISIS started invading Iraqi cities, all the stories about how the Iraqi army was just frantically running away, or the same thing in Syria and to some extent in Lebanon. The image of the terrifying ISIS fighter coming in, and if they capture us, they're going to cut our heads, and people frantically running away. This was created through this media terrorism message. And the second one is gaining exposure, bringing their brand name up, their credibility up, to the point of being able to recruit supporters. So for the journalists in the room today, or the aspiring journalists, this creates a dilemma. This creates a problem. A terrorist attack happens, you cover it, you are actually serving the terrorist group, right? So do we cover it, do we not cover it? And there's a lot of research that has been done on that. There was a study that was released recently with advice on how to cover and how not to cover. I will talk a little bit briefly about it, but I don't want to turn the lecture fully into how to cover terrorism. If we think about terrorist attacks, they are well-timed. The location is selected carefully for maximum exposure, symbolic elements that generate certain emotions. The perfect timing, the 9/11 attack, for example, happened during rush hour in the morning in New York City, with guaranteed at least dozens of cameras, video and photo cameras pointed towards the Twin Towers from tourists or otherwise, and also helicopters from TV stations circulating around to achieve this maximum exposure. Same things with attacks on train stations in Europe, and same thing with the people who are being executed live on camera. For example, the UK humanitarian aid worker Alan Henning. So the Independent could have covered it this way, right? They could have put his image on their newspaper and published it, and would have probably gotten a lot of exposure. But they were savvy enough to do this, and they wrote, "On Friday, a decent, caring human being was murdered in cold blood. Our thoughts are with his family. He was killed on camera for the sole purpose of propaganda. Here is the news, not the propaganda." Again, we can go into many side discussions on how to cover, how not to cover. On one end of the spectrum, some people argue you should never cover terrorism. But that creates two problems. One, if an ongoing terrorist attack is happening, you are not doing your job by serving the people and helping them protect themselves and avoid being in a certain place at a certain time. And second, it has proven that if you don't cover terrorism, or even if you limit the coverage of terrorism, you actually push this group who is using terrorism to up their game, to use even more forceful, more bloody methods in order to gain this kind of exposure. And I think, to me, the video that was produced around the execution, the burning alive of the Jordanian pilot, and we'll talk about that, I'll show you some parts of the video in a moment, is evidence of such elevation of terrorist attacks. On the other side of the spectrum, we should cover it fully, which again feeds into the goals and objectives of the terrorist attack or the terrorist group. Let me skip this for a moment. So, one of the additional elements that we live in today, the additional factors that we live in today that helps the spread of this type of messages and this type of terrorism is the availability of social media, is the ease of use of technology. And here I go back to these ideas of conspiracy theories. How could these groups produce such impeccable, amazing professional videos? I can tell you, and you probably, especially the academics in the room, I'm sure you know of many of your students who are able to produce some of these great videos. So just try to imagine that among all the people that we have in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, or any part of our countries, that I'm pretty sure you would trust that they can recruit some people who have these skills. At one point, I was interviewed by Al Jazeera, and they were telling me, it's impossible. How could they produce such amazing videos? And the same claim was actually done during different conflicts in this part of the world. How could a group, and I'm not trying to compare Hezbollah to ISIS, but how could a group like Hezbollah produce such amazing video quality? Well, whether you agree or disagree with any of the groups that are in this, operating in this part of the world, they have capacity, they have agency, and they have knowledge. So let's not underestimate how much our people actually have skills, whether you agree or disagree with these groups. But in addition to that, if you think of the pre-internet age, where we were mainly one-to-many model of broadcasting, TV, radio, and newspapers. There was a lot of control, there was clear gatekeepers of these messages. The early years of the internet brought in two-way communication. People can post static web pages. We started with web blogs, and it became more and more sophisticated. And with social media, now we not only have two-way communication, but we can also target individuals in a two-way mechanism. So imagine that, for example, an ISIS video, an ISIS terrorist attack was put up there on YouTube, and somebody comments on it. And that somebody maybe puts something that is somewhat sympathetic to ISIS. What happens after that? It's not just pushing the message to the masses out there. It's also targeting individual. Oh, there's a comment, a sympathetic comment. And then somebody from ISIS could follow up with that person and keep communicating with them to recruit them. And you would think that this is not a very effective method until you see an extreme case where a woman from rural USA with no connections to the Arab world, to the Muslim religion, to any idea, political ideology in this part of the world, was almost recruited by an ISIS supporter. I'm going to show you a short video of this in a moment.
The first thing they told me was I was not allowed to listen to music. The second thing they told me is like how to pray. They did tell me that it is a sin to stay in non-Muslim lands if you have a chance to go to Muslim lands. Because why would we stay in the land of disbelievers and doubters? I live in like a modular home with my grandparents, and it's in the middle of nowhere. We lived in the city, we could walk wherever we wanted, and here it was a lot better in a lot of ways because it was safer, but it was also, because it was also safer, it was a lot more boring. I've met my friends on the internet. I have more community with them than I have with people in my own community. I was looking for people who agreed with what they were doing so I could understand why they were doing it. And it was actually really easy to find them. Faisal, he is my friend. He always answered my questions. He always brought up things against Christianity, but in a kind way.
So, I mean, they can watch the video, it's online. It's called Flirting with ISIS. You just Google Flirting with ISIS New York Times and you'll find it. Eventually the FBI intervenes, they try to track him down and they save the person. It's quite strange and creepy how the communication between these two is similar to a pedophile trying to recruit or get a child. But it's effective. It's effective. And imagine, this is, again, was she 21 or 23, living in rural America, a white American, has no connection to this part of the world, and built this relationship, was almost recruited by this group. One of the peak elements of their propaganda, whether it's in production value, justification, using specific rhetoric, a consistent rhetoric that not only justifies their killings, but also builds on this clash of civilization rhetoric. Well, I will talk as we go through this. I'll keep the volume a little bit down. So as background to this, the Jordanian government was bombing certain areas that ISIS controlled, and one of their pilots got struck down, kidnapped, and later eventually put on video and burned alive. We can discuss that in a moment. I know there's a lot of controversy around the interpretation of this video.
For strikes against ISIS, we're only looking for volunteers.
So this is almost a 23-minute video.
Please step forward.
Almost half of it is justification.
على وقع الحملات الصليبية على ديار الإسلام أعمل الجراح من ضعف.
So you can see here they're referring to the Crusades, and they go into the connections between Arab governments, calling them puppet regimes to the West, using different codes from the Jordanian king and Jordanian pilot fighters, and then they put in the actual pilot they captured alive as proof that he has committed a crime. And their burning of this, their killing of this pilot is basically justified because he committed this crime, and not just a crime, he committed a horrific crime. Oh, let me show you a few graphic images here showing how Arab governments are subservient to this Western coalition, including Canada. Oh, the connection with Israel. And they use the word Yahud. And then, so look at this, 14.5 minutes of justifications, and they're not done yet. And then we see the pilot walking around, and there's parallel editing here happening between the images of children and civilians being pulled out of the rubble, and supposedly the pilot walking around the crime scene that he committed. Not only sophisticated production in terms of technical production, but also storytelling techniques. Again, using parallel editing, which is a technique used when there is a slow story. You superimpose two stories together and you cut between them to keep things moving and exciting. And then building up to a climactic moment. So using the story, the classic story curve. And I'll show you where the climactic moment is. Displaying the power of ISIS in uniforms, very organized, again, creating the credibility. I will stop it before the burning starts. But I do want you to notice the sound, the special effects. Notice the heartbeat. Multi-cameras used. chant. So this is the exact climactic moment. And after that, of course, they leave the pilot burning on camera, and then they bring a bulldozer and stamp him in, just emulating the effects of his bombing on civilians, supposedly. And then what they do in the last 2-3 minutes is they put up the names of other Jordanian pilots with a monetary award for anyone who captures or kills them. So there's always this action oriented at the end of their message. There's never just fear. There's always either a recruitment, come fight with us, or a message to fight wherever you are. I know you have many questions about that. I just want to make a couple more points here. Actually, maybe we'll take 5 minutes of questions and then we'll continue. Go ahead. There's people there.
So I have a question. Isn't the way they're filming it or representing it, at least in me, it created a sort of sympathy for the pilot. So I felt this poor person is going to be burnt alive. And I know they justified their actions before, but doesn't it create the same effect in other viewers as well?
Exactly. If you remember in our first day, we talk about media literacy, like different people interpret things differently, right? And they seem to be very savvy about this principle when it comes to media interpretation. They spent more than half the video justifying why they're going to kill this pilot, using grievances. Okay, and here's a very, very important moment for matter for everybody to understand. The grievances that ISIS use are not imaginary grievances. Okay, the grievances exist. So the loss of Palestine is a real thing, and they use that. The impoverishment of the Arab world is a real thing, and they use that. The division and weakening of the Arab world is a real thing, and they use that. And whether you support or don't support the governments that you are in the Arab world, I'm going to claim this. The puppet regime thing in the Arab world and the sustainability of these regimes in the Arab world with the help of the West is a real thing, at least in the mind of many Arabs, right? And they use that. This is exactly what advertising methodology does, right? They use a real insecurity, right? You want to look cool. This is real. People want to look cool, want to feel cool. Why don't you take a cigarette? The cigarette, that's the problem. The cigarette is not a solution. And here's the problem with ISIS. ISIS uses real grievances, but they present themselves as a solution, and they are not the solution, at least in my mind, and I hope in your minds too. So yes, Jordanians, when they watch that, especially people connected, members of the family of the pilot, people connected to the government, people who are supportive of the army's effort, the Jordanian army's effort against ISIS, of course, they're going to be sympathizing with the pilot. But there are also people who would sympathize with the ISIS message, right? People who are not savvy about this method of using real grievances and presenting oneself as a solution. Donald Trump used that, right? And many, many Americans voted for him. Alt-right politicians in Europe use that. There's a right-wing president in Austria today, and you would think of these societies as highly educated, highly progressive, highly secular, but they actually were fooled by this populist rhetoric and delivered politicians who use such rhetoric, right? Other questions? Someone in the back, yeah, go ahead.
عفوا دكتور جاد، بس أحب أوضح نقطة ذكرتها حضرتك، أنه القاعدة ليست نفسها داعش، أنه القاعدة تهاجم عدو خارجي وداعش تهاجم عدو داخلي. بس أذكر يعني حدث صار معي أنه أثبت لك أنه داعش هو نفسها القاعدة. في سنة 2005 كنت ذاهبة في رحلة سياحية إلى سوريا عبر الطريق البري. وصلنا إلى القامشلي واللي هي منطقة
ممكن بس أنا بدي بس عالج موضوع الفيديو هلا، إذا في أسئلة خارج الفيديو خلينا
لا أنا من خلال محاضرتك دكتور، أنت محاضرتك ذكرت بها معلومات
بالضبط، بس هلا هاي ال5 دقائق بس للفيديو
ما
اللي
رح أطول أكثر من دقيقتين.
بس لحظة، عم نحكي عن الفيديو بس هلا بالاخر رح اترك 10 دقائق لكل الاسئله اللي بدكم اياها، اذا في سؤال او اي كومنت عن الفيديو هيدا بليز تفضلي.
طيب خلينا لعد
ما عندي مشكله انه ما تميزي القاعده من ايسيس. اوكي.
شكرا استاذ جاد. طبعا التقنيه مهمه جدا جدا في هذا العصر. الفيديو مال كساسبه كان لاقى شهره كبيره واصداء كبيره. يعني شخص استشهد من قبل عصابات داعش، بينما الآلاف من العراقيين لم تسلط عليهم الأضواء، لم تذكرهم وسائل الإعلام بشكل كبير. وهذا يعني إشادة بقولك أنه وسائل الإعلام والتصوير الفوتوغرافي إلى آخره من التقنيات هي مهمة جدا في إيصال الصورة للعالم بشكل أجمع. طبعا هي إضافة أكثر مما هو سؤال.
بالضبط، شكرا. Exactly. رح جاوبك بالإنجليزي إذا مش ممكن. The production quality, but also there's a new element in this video. So for a long time, I'm going to show you a video by AJ Plus, Al Jazeera. Well, it's no longer with Al Jazeera now. That claimed there's going to be a media blackout for ISIS terrorism. And then ISIS responds with this. a new method of killing. We're not just going to cut heads off. We're actually going to burn somebody alive, and we're going to create this incredible Hollywood-level story, Hollywood-level production to entice you to put it. And I was precisely interviewed on Al Jazeera the same day this happened, and in the background they were playing the video. And I was yelling at the producer, how could you be doing that when you are actually claiming that there's a blackout? Stop this video. You are actually serving what they are doing. Let me show you this video very quickly.
There's one thing we can all agree on. The Islamic State group propaganda machine is absolutely terrifying, but it's effective. As we speak, their media center is producing slick, multilingual, Hollywood-esque videos and distributing them on social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr. Their recorded beheadings and mass slaughters are too many to ignore. But just like our colleagues at other news organizations, we at AJ Plus face a dilemma. How do we report news about ISIS, especially in the absence of independent journalists on the ground? How should we handle their pornographic violence, their news programs, and their softer, more emotional messages? It's all clearly intended to manipulate the world's perception of them. Should we rebroadcast it on our platforms? Should we ignore it and refuse to engage with it altogether? If this is our generation's information war, how do we win? Where as journalists do we position ourselves on that battlefield? Propaganda in wartime is nothing new. It's used to strike fear in the hearts of enemies and break down their will to fight. It also maintains unity and goodwill among allies banded together for a common goal. The Nazis were experts at it. So are the Russians, the Israelis, the Chinese, and the Americans.
On weapons of mass destruction.
The list goes on. But the tactics of modern propaganda have changed, even in just the last few years. It wasn't too long ago that Osama bin Laden had to find a middleman to deliver his grainy VHS tapes from his cave to a media outlet willing to broadcast his messages. Even then, journalists ultimately decided what was or wasn't shared with the world. But that isn't up to us anymore. Social media has democratized the spread of information. Anyone, anywhere, can post a message. The perceived success of ISIS is through these tools, and this strategy is problematic for journalists. Their propaganda has crowded out independent journalists who undermine their narrative, and reporting on this conflict is deadly. The recorded beheadings of James Foley and Stephen Sotloff were meant to horrify Western audiences and grab our attention, but they also sent a clear message to other reporters: don't come here or you'll pay with your life. It's also a message many Syrian and Iraqi journalists have been forced to confront as ISIS tries to silence them with threats, kidnapping, and execution. Even more complicated is their approach. They've crafted a central message that isn't just spread through videos of savagery. They try to control their own narrative using a diversity of voices, news programs hosted by hostages to tell their own version of events, to pictures of their daily lives using selfies or cats to balance media reports of their brutality. Many of our colleagues in the industry have participated in a media blackout anytime a brutal video emerges. For some, that means not using ISIS's footage in conveying the news. Others incorporate still images from the videos because they feel that it conveys the broader story with less of the propaganda. When news of James Foley's execution broke, AJ Plus chose to show bits from the video. We reacted in the moment, but we have since reversed that decision.
I think we became aware of the terrible...
So, going back to this issue of the dilemma of covering or not covering terrorism, the question today is no longer if the mass media covers it. If you go back to what Gretchen was saying, this democratization of media tools allows anybody to post it. So this brings us back to the issue of the concept of media literacy. If we do not create a citizenry that is media literate and able to decide whether to send or not to send a message out and to promote or not to promote ISIS, we are going to fail in this battle. It's no longer a matter of relying on the media institutions, the dominant media institutions around the world, to filter, whether I'm talking about YouTube or I'm talking about Facebook or CNN or any of these stations. Because we also now have the ability as citizens to push the terrorist message out or to limit it. So just like the concept of fake news that we spoke about in earlier lectures, to think about these messages and to share them or not to share them, to eliminate them or even to send warnings about them. The last few minutes I'd like to dedicate before I start into questions, other things that ISIS, other communication tools or methods that ISIS use. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about that. One of you mentioned branding. They definitely have a strong visual identity. If you think of these three images, at one point were in disconnected areas around the Arab world, and you can see their symbolic black garbs with putting their prisoners in orange jumpsuits, symbolic of the prisoners of Guantanamo Bay. You can see also the same thing in their visuals, in their graphics. The interesting thing about branding is even when you attack the brand, you're actually promoting the brand. So this is a group of another Syrian extremist group that is executing ISIS fighters, but you can see that they're basically playing into their brand and promoting it further. They have multiple magazines that are also branded consistently. Like the video said, they have many videos that shows the positive side. They show people in the market eating ice cream, where they saturate the color, show children walking around just to show that their areas that they have control over is safe. They also hack into many video games, not only change the characters, which is quite typical of many groups before, many other groups have done that, but they even have changed the military tools. They use these explosives. I'll show you very briefly here.
وذل البغى فيا قوم هبوا لدرب الكما فإما حياة تسر الهدى الله أكبر العزة لله سوى فيها الله أكبر.
So IEDs were not part of the original game, so they even were able to add that. They've even used different methods of hacking, and they were also counter-hacked. They have an incredible PR machine. I've experienced it myself. I was once being interviewed on, I don't remember what the station was, maybe LBC, and then within minutes they responded. I claimed that one of their pictures had a 50% chance of being doctored. The anchor, the host, misinterpreted what I said and said 50% of the image was doctored, and then they quickly responded, literally a few minutes after the show. Such and such, Dr. Jad Melki, his claim is false, here's what we did, etc. They target children with educational messages. You can see here the alphabet with the very child-appropriate images of weapons targeted towards each letter. So there are many other methods, and I'm going to dedicate the last 6 minutes to whatever comments, whatever questions that you have. Maybe we'll take 3 questions at a time and I'll answer. You want to say something?
It's not a question, it's just like I noticed throughout the magazines and even the font they use in English and in Arabic, it's the same. Mm-hmm. So again, it's like they have a guideline, branding guideline that everyone uses. So I'm sorry, it's impressive.
Yeah, exactly. It is impressive. Those of you who have ever worked in graphic design or in an organization, there's a manual that tells you your font should be this size, this color, this much inches from the top of the document and from the side of the document. Exactly. If you analyze their graphic, their visual elements, you will see they're very consistent across the board. Other questions? Someone in the back. You wanted to say something about Al-Qaeda being and ISIS being the same. تفضل.
دكتور، بعد هذا الاستعراض قلت بأن الإعلام هو أكسجين الإرهاب، وإنه إذا الإعلام أغفل تغطية حادث إرهابي ربما نحث أن يكون أكثر دمويا، وبالتالي نحن نخدم التنظيمات الإرهابية ونخدم أجندتها، وربما حكومات تستغل أيضا هذه الحوادث لخدمة لأجندتها. لكن نحن كإعلاميين نمشي في حق الألغام، كيف يعني نغطي هذا هاي الحساسية وكيف لا نخدم هذه الأجندة أو تلك.
Okay, thank you. Let me take another one and I'll answer you both. Go ahead.
أتكلم؟ بالنسبة لموضوع القاعدة والآيسيس، في 2005 كنا ذاهبين في رحلة سياحية إلى سوريا عبر الطريق البري، فكانوا وصلنا إلى قامشلي اللي هي بين سوريا والعراق. ثلاث باصات تمشي، وفجأة أصبح هناك إطلاق نار على المسافرين، وتوقفت الباصات. صعدوا علينا مجموعة حتى ما ملثمين ولكن مسلحين، أصبحوا يأخذون الشباب والرجال على الهوية. عفوا يعني أنه أقول أنه أي واحد شيعي يأخذوه. وأيضا هنا خلوا السلاح في رأس أختي بسبب أنها كانت لا تلبس الحجاب، واعترفوا يعني عرفوا عن نفسهم نحن دولة الخلافة الإسلامية، عرفوا عن نفسهم بعد لحد ما طلع داعش، يعني كانت القاعدة. بهالتصرف هذا طبعا بعدها انقطعت الرحلات عن هذا الطريق بسبب لأنه قاموا يهاجمون المسافرين. هنا صارت بالفعل هذا الحكي بال 2005. بال 2006 أصبح بالعراق بغداد بالذات القتل على الهوية السني، يعني الميليشيات الشيعية تقتل السني. وتتذكرون أنه ب 2006 صار القتل بالشوارع. هذا هدف تحقق لهم من خلال هاي الغارة اللي سووها على المسافرين. أيضا أنه خلوا أنه المسلم كل واحد يعني سني هو داعشي أو إرهابي. هاي الفكرة اللي روجوها بالإعلام.
Thank you. Let me address both of your questions. The question about how to cover terrorism is long and wide, and I'll share with you a document that a French colleague has actually produced about some tips and advices on how to do that. Again, this whole academy, this whole movement to promote and advance media literacy in the Arab world, I think is an important component and element in fighting terrorism and in fighting extremism, populist ideologies, sectarianism, all our divisions, and trying to elevate our societies. Gretchen gave a lecture about how free, independent media can be used today for good. I gave a lecture on how it can be used for bad. And I hope through your teaching of media and digital literacy, you can create these groups and these communities in your society who are able to powerfully use independent free media to advance society rather than take us back to the age of religion controlling our lives and specific religion dominating and discriminating against others and killing others. I don't want to argue with you about whether Al-Qaeda and ISIS are the same or not. ISIS is a splinter group from Al-Qaeda, right? They started with Al-Qaeda, then they disagreed on two main things: the far enemy versus the close enemy, declaring the Khilafah now or waiting until later. The question of whether we treat them the same is in terms of how to respond to them. When the different governments around the world were trying to fight Al-Qaeda, their main strategy was to suffocate their funding. However, ISIS, when they went into certain areas, they immediately started the economic machine running so they could become economically independent. So this method obviously did not work with ISIS. This was when the claim that we need to treat ISIS in a different way started. They both come from the same extremist ideology. They both maybe have it's the same long-term vision. They differ in strategy. They differ in what are the next steps they want to do. But frankly, this is not even my area or my expertise. My area of research or my interest today is about the relationship between extremist group and how they use media, how they use social media and independent media to advance their goals, and how we can deal and react to that. All right, so I just want to put one more slide up and we will end on that. Just to summarize here, trying to re-understand, reframe these groups, whether they're extremist groups or not, and how they use independent media, maybe even taking lessons from them, maybe even learning their methods and being able. It is quite amazing today that such an extremist group has been able to elevate their media message to such heights when our NGOs and our activists cannot even work together. And I cite here, for example, feminist groups in Lebanon. There are maybe at least 12 of them. And they cannot figure out how to work together. Each one is working in a different direction. We're going to have a panel about that next week. I don't know why different groups in the Arab world, especially Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, why do these activists not work together, not create a brand, not create a if ISIS can create a graphic template and magazines and videos with such quality, I'm sure all these other activists can. And this, again, feeds us back into Gretchen's lecture. But the one thing I want to highlight at the end, the last statement, all these groups that are claiming that let's counter extremism and counter terrorism, short-term, misleading, dreaming of something that's not going to happen. To start with, fighting terrorism is the wrong term. You cannot fight a method of war. It's like fighting assassinations. Everybody can assassinate, right? What we need to do is not react to this group. We need to build a movement that is positive, that fills in the vacuum, the political vacuum, the ideological vacuum that we have, and address our grievances, our real grievances, our collective grievances that 99% of us agree on, and that will all combine us all together, whether our different countries, our different religions, different groups, different identities. So this is what I mean by building a movement or building the next wave. And I hope media literacy in the Arab world can contribute to that. Thank you very much. So if you have any questions, I'll sit here for a little bit before you